Good afternoon. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to what I promise will be a fascinating and very informative discussion with our guest this afternoon, and also to have the pleasure of being able to moderate the discussion and to initiate the Q&A, which is going to be, I think, one of the highlights for our discussion over the next hour and a half. The topic is one of, I think, of perennial interest over the last decade and a half, and one of increasingly urgent interest, both for the United States government, but also for U.S. economy, for infrastructure, for our relations with our allies, for our military. It's become an all-encompassing concern and an all-encompassing focus for a lot of the work which now goes on in terms of thinking about where America's national security lies, where the future of our alliances lie, and how we go about protecting and defending not only our own way of life in the United States, but also protecting and defending the institutions that preserve peace and security around the world. And I'm talking about cybersecurity, of the issues that involved and that revolve around this new emerging domain within the zones of conflict that exist among nation states today, but also too the emerging threats that are not only present today, but also looming in the horizon. And one of the things we're going to be able to do is to question our guest, our distinguished guest, on what some of those future and emerging threats look like, as well as the status of present threats. The guest that we're talking about is, of course, Ambassador Sorin Ducaru. Sorin Ducaru, who is former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, and also former Romanian ambassador to the United States from 2001 to 2006, as well as Romania's former ambassador to the United Nations. Before joining Hudson, and by the way, it's now official, Sorin Ducaru is now our new fellow here at Hudson Institute, became official on December 1st. And so this is not only a chance for us to, in order to get information and to hear a discussion about the key issues involved, but also to inaugurate and welcome you to Hudson and to our sphere of activities, as well as our home here in Washington, D.C. So before joining Hudson, Ambassador Ducaru assumed his position as NATO Assistant Secretary General in 2013, where his responsibilities included oversight in the areas of counterterrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, and the subject for today's discussion, cyber defense. He managed the implementation of the NATO Enhanced Cyber Policy, which recognized cyber as a formal operational domain linked to NATO's primary task, which is collective defense. Ambassador Ducaru also developed NATO's Cyber Partnership Network, which includes organizations such as the European Union and the United Nations. Fascinating work, which I hope he'll be prepared to discuss with us today. Sorin Ducaru graduated from the Polytechna University of Bucharest in 1998, and from the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in 1992, and was associated lecturer in European and International Studies there between 1993 and 1998. At the same time that I was teaching at George Mason University. We have a shared academic teaching background. In addition, Ambassador Ducaru has a Master of Philosophy degree in International Relations from the University of Amsterdam. And in 2005, he was awarded a PhD in International Economics by the Bucharest Academy of Economic Studies. Now, what all of this reflects is the fact that his education and background brings a strong hybrid blend of both technical expertise in applied electronics and computer studies, that's on one side, and a deep immersion in political and economic studies on the other. And it's this hybrid expertise that's made him such a valuable leader for NATO, and why he's going to be a major asset for us here working at Hudson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ducaro. What I wanted to do is to sort of have us engage in a kind of informal discussion over some of the main points here in terms of cybersecurity threats now and in the future, and about the ways in which NATO has been taking important and innovative steps in order to deal with those challenges. The great thing about cybersecurity, by the way, and discussing it is that the topic is never dull. And the range of discussion of what is important and what is essential keeps changing. In other words, if we had had this discussion on the cyber domain, let's say 10 years ago, we would have covered one set of issues and questions. If we'd had the discussion 5 years ago, it would have been a different set. And even 2 years ago, the kinds of discussion we would have about the cyber domain, about protection and cyber defense would have a very different cast and a very different sort of focus than it's going to have today. So my first question to you is, from that standpoint, what's hot and what's not now in terms of cyber with regard to NATO and cyber and the NATO agenda, especially on the cyber front?
Well, thank you for the welcoming and for the introduction, Dr. Herman. It's really good to be back in Washington, where I spent some good portion of my life and professional life, and it's good to be part of the Hudson team to share some of the experience that I had in the last years. Now, you pointed to the fact that the cyber domains probably best reflects the area of acceleration in which we are living. Yes, it's acceleration of opportunity, but it's also acceleration in the sense of the threat landscape evolution. If I were to describe qualitatively the main trends in the cyber threat landscape, as we see it these days, I would point on a number of key aspects that are worth to follow. Number one, I think we see an increase in frequency, intensity, persistency, and sophistication of the cyber attacks. We are in the area of the advanced, in the era of advanced persistent threats. It's not just like the waves pattern that we saw in the past, but it's like, continuous persistent pattern of especially of those high-end actors that are looking towards everything from government institutions to key business sectors. And this is with the increase of the cyber crime phenomenon. So you see these two parallel elements: exponential increase of cyber crime, and also increase in persistency and sophistication of those attacks that go beyond cybercrime and that probably have behind other actors than those in the crime area. I can also, and by the way, this is what NATO was mainly looking towards, like the high-end threats. NATO is in the NATO's mandate in cyber defense. What it says, it's focusing on the those threats that are against government systems, strategic systems, military, not so much the cybercrime sector, although the link between them is straightforward. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight is the constant look of threat actors towards the soft targets, soft bellies, soft spots in any of the on the attack surface. And what one could see more recently, for example, also at NATO level, so beyond this kind of continuous threat against NATO networks who are under centralized protection, more attempts, for example, to look to private accounts, maybe of military deployed in operations. And there were these stories also in the press of disruptions of, let's say, private phones of US and allied military in the enhanced forward presence operations in the Baltic countries. Some of them synchronized with the famous Zapad exercise. Or, going after private accounts of officials or family members and so on. So interesting links of, high sophisticated attacks, persistence against networks that are strategic, but also looking to the soft spots in order to circumvent and maybe enter through and bring Trojans around it. I should also mention the preoccupation of the increasing link between cybercrime threat actors and potential state actors, the so-called aspect of proxies. And sometimes most of the time they're used for deniability aspects, the so-called privateering phenomenon. Also, this can be extremely concerning since it might lead to the other concern, the potential growing nexus between cyber and terrorism. So if cybercrime actors can be for hire by state actors, they could be also by non-state actors, by terrorist actors. And last but not least, the more obvious links between cyber attacks and military operations. And it's not entirely new. There were examples of this, but in more recent time, we realized that the, let's say, quote-unquote battlefield has the tendency to become more and more digital, and there's a lot of activity kind of below the threshold of
this is where it bleeds into what we call hybrid warfare.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So this would be the qualitative description of the landscape and the main trends that we see nowadays.
Yeah. So what you've got then is you've got a horizon in which you've got this sort of growing range of cyber threats, whether it's cyber crime, whether it's what the cyber experts call advanced persistent threats.
ATPs, yeah.
And the linkage between those two. And also that the range of targets has expanded from kind of more sort of formal attacks on institutions or on corporations or on government agencies to now going after soldiers or military personnel's personal phones and personal records, and in order to provide that kind of disruptive activity as well as data gathering. Now, in this kind of growing environment, it seems to me that this is an enormous task to deal with all of this, and that cooperation, no one country can confront this and deal with this. Cooperation is essential. So from where you were and from where you look forward, what are going to be the key inflection points in terms of that cooperation and on the cyber front, both for cyber defense, but also for, let's say, for kind of a rapid reaction force to what's coming?
Well, I think you touched the finger on, put the finger on one of the key aspects that is essential in cyber defense. I always say that cyber defense is like a team sport, and it's the only way we can overcome some of the, let's say, intrinsic challenges of this threat. And let me just a minute focus on this. What's so special with these kind of threats? They are linked to the dynamics of technological evolution. They are favoring offense, defense, because the offender needs to find one entry point on the attack surface while the defender needs to cover the whole surface. This is hugely asymmetric. They offer this element of anonymity and deniability and difficulty of attribution. So the only way to overcome this is actually to bring defenders together in terms of exchanging information, exchanging best practices, and frankly, being able to support each other in the case of attacks. And when I'm speaking about this cooperation, we need to think it or to address it at many levels. Yes, among countries, and the North Atlantic Alliance is a great platform to address this 21st century security challenges, and I'll be able to explain more how we evolved in actually putting more substance on the approach. But it also it's important to have cooperation in a multi-stakeholder approach between government entities and industry, academia, civil society. After all, this is a domain that was created and it's owned and operated more than 80% by the private sector, by the industry. I think we need to foster even more cooperation among the international or regional organizations that can bring a value added. And this is where NATO has supported its cooperation with the EU in really many ways: information exchange of best practices, curricula, concepts, and actually getting engaged into exercises and operational approach, but also with UN in support of development of norms and confidence building measures in cyberspace in terms of clarifying the applicability of international law to cyberspace, or organizations like the Organization for OEC, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, on the so-called CBMs, confidence building measures, just to name a few. So I'm a strong supporter of these collaborative platforms, and personally I worked a lot also on leveraging the advantage of having an alliance, a collective defense alliance, and bringing cyber into it, but also expanding the network of partnership to partner countries, international organizations, and to industry and academia. And if you want, I can dwell more into it, but I'll let you steer the discussion.
I think it'd be fascinating to get into it, and particularly from the point of view of how, with the ever-expanding range of institutions that require this kind of cooperation, whether there arise certain kinds of contradictions and questions. For example, we talk about US and NATO, NATO and the European Union, NATO, European Union, United Nations. But of course, the United Nations also includes some charter members who count today as advanced persistent threats. So how do you see the sort of at the largest possible reach and range of how we arrive at a sort of a common understanding of what cooperation in the cyber domain needs to look like and where it goes? How do you sort of see at the highest level where this could possibly go? Is it possible, for example, when I was in Tokyo at the Mount Fuji dialogue discussion, we had a leading figure from Microsoft who was talking about Microsoft's effort in developing what it calls a Geneva Convention for governing the cyber domain and for establishing rules and conventions by which nation states and countries would abstain from certain kinds of practices, or if they find their citizens are engaged in those same kinds of practices, would face a moral, if not a legal, obligation to stop that, curtail that activity, or at least to inform others about its development. Do you see that as something that could loom ahead, a Geneva Convention at some day?
Well, there are many initiatives that have been already unfolding in this sense. So already long before the initiative by Microsoft, and I will come back to it in terms of explaining the meaning and the objectives. So long before that, under the UN framework, a number of key stakeholders in the UN established so-called governmental groups of experts on cyber defense. This group of experts produced two important reports. One was in 2013, one in 2015, and actually these reports included some of those conclusions that you mentioned. First, recognition of the applicability of international law, including international humanitarian law in cyberspace. International humanitarian law applies in the context of conflicts. So that would be above the threshold of conflict, of armed attack. So the conclusion was that those kinds of rules, and this is where we have a Geneva Convention that regulates the behavior of states in times of and governments in times of conflict. They also established a number of norms, like states should abstain, for example, attacking critical energy infrastructure or telecommunications infrastructure or national computer incident response centers, considering, or national cybersecurity centers, as there are in a number of countries, considering these things would be extremely destabilizing. So in these two reports, you have elements that have been produced as guidelines, as voluntary norms. So these are not conventions where states have signed. By the way, the United Nations GG was a group of 25 members. They brought their report to the General Assembly, where the report was noted by the General Assembly. So it has a political, let's say, role of political guidance, but it doesn't have, it's not a law under the UN, like it's not a Security Council sanctioned decision or so on. But even political guidance can become law due to state practice under customary law process. So this was the scope of such exercise. At the same time, the OEC has established also two consecutive sets of confidence building measures in cyberspace that were establishing, for example, communications between principles between member states. Also, in the case of a crisis, states should be able to send to each other relevant information so that it could not lead to any misinterpretation or escalation. This was the main meaning of these set of confidence building measures. And there is a recent initiative of experts. It's called the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace that was launched at the Munich Security Council conference this year. That includes 30 high-level experts with backgrounds in private or public sector or academia that is also aiming to come with some principles or norms that then should be taken as voluntary norms and rules by states for their responsible behavior in cyberspace. And I'm coming now to the Microsoft idea of Geneva Convention, so-called Digital Geneva Convention. I think the point is to also support the development of some rules whereby state actors in their operational cyber engagement would prevent negative impact upon industry, business, or upon citizens and humans. It's not necessarily something that refers to the context of, let's say, international conflict or war. I think their intention was to have this norm operate below the threshold. That's why it's a bit misleading, because the original Geneva Convention speaks about norms in times of conflict. Yeah. While the main focus of the idea initially from Microsoft focuses on operational cyber engagement by state actors below the threshold. But again, like any initiatives in this field, it's valuable. And I think this has to evolve not just among governments, but also in this multi-stakeholder approach. More than anything, the cyber domain needs to include the key players, governments, industry, and citizens and their civic platforms.
Yeah. Let's go back to your work at NATO for a minute. Looking back on it and thinking about the work that you did there on, particularly on cybersecurity and protecting and cyber defense, can you give us an idea about sort of what were the basic principles or assumptions you brought to your task of getting NATO to work together and NATO countries to work together in order to build an effective and robust cyber defense framework?
Well, in order to come to these concrete aspects, let me give you a sense of how NATO evolved. Because NATO evolved from addressing cyber like a technical, purely technical aspect, to bringing it close to its reason of being, to collective defense, to strategy and policy. It was in the turn of the millennium that actually NATO brought this up at summit level, even if it was first as a technical issue. The need to establish some NATO kind of computer incident response team approach. In NATO it's called NSIG, NATO Computer Incident Response Center, in order to assure protection of its networks. And that was very much an approach like any other enterprise. So you were an enterprise, you had networks, they were supposed to be functional and also secure. And by the way, during the NATO operation in the Balkans, 1999, there were some cyber attacks against NATO for the first time that generated a certain level of disruption. So this was the beginning, 2002. But then it was left, the whole story was left to the technicians. There was a decision to invest resources, bring some skills, bring hardware, software, and it's the IT specialist business. It wasn't until 2007 and the attacks against Estonia that the issue came on the North Atlantic Council agenda, because that one was a hugely disruptive attack that frankly brought a government of a member state to a standstill for a while. Estonia, very wired country from this point of view, forward-leaning into bringing e-economy and internet connectivity forward, harnessing the innovation. Also showed the importance of looking into the security aspects. And there were interesting debates at the North Atlantic Council. There was even a discussion, is this attack, which was in April 2007, we actually had this year 10 years, a decade celebration of what some call Web War I. Was this something that should lead to the invocation of Article 5 and NATO's collective defense clause? And the conclusion then was that, well, NATO has to really start to address it at policy level. At the end of the day, Estonians did not ask for Article 5, but the conclusion was NATO has to shift its approach from technical to addressing it as a policy and strategy issue. And the year after, at the 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO had the first policy on cyber defense. And that was quite foundational in the sense that it established the division of labor, still with NATO having the main focus on defending its own networks, while allies having responsibility of their own. But it was for the first time that it established some guidelines for how nations should better protect their strategic systems, while there were clear benchmarks for NATO's own systems, and also guidelines for information exchange. 3 years after, after the Lisbon summit in 2010, where NATO adopted the new strategic concept and where the 21st century security challenges were at the forefront. And this is the year when also the division that I led was created, Emerging Security Challenges. NATO had an upgrade of its policy and for the first time introduced cyber defense capability targets in the so-called NATO defense planning process. So benchmarks for each nation. They were focused on what it says, cyber defense, so purely resilience, purely defensive targets, but the aim was not to allow weakest links in the chain. And for the first time, the focus was shifting from just investing in NATO's own networks, but also doing more for allies. The big inflection point was 2014, where the enhanced policy on cyber defense was adopted, and that one linked cyber defense to collective defense, even to the possibility of invoking Article 5 if a cyber attack reaches a threshold of an armed attack or a conventional attack with the impact of those. Secondly, it recognized the applicability of international law in cyberspace. Thirdly, it established the partnerships network with partner nations, with international organizations, and with industry and academia. And then the last, I would say, milestone was just a year and a half ago at the Warsaw Summit, where allies adopted what is called a cyber defense pledge, very much inspired by the defense investment pledge, only without any 2% or any figure attached. But it was prioritizing investment in cyber defenses because this is the fastest evolving threat. So from your defense budgets, for your investment at government level, put this on the priority list, bring the issue of cyber at high strategic level in governments, and also expand the focus not just on government or military system, but to critical infrastructure as well. So this was the issue of the pledge, and at the same time, I recognize that cyberspace is for NATO the fourth operational domain, like air, land, and sea, in which allies have to defend themselves as effectively and as in these domains. Now, I always say this was not a code word for NATO going offensive on cyber or automatically. It meant that in terms of approaching the resilience and defense, it changed the assumption and recognized the fact that it has to operate in a contested environment and potentially disrupted, and also it allowed the possibility to employ voluntary contributions of cyber effect by allied nations to the benefit of NATO's operations and missions. So not developing any offensive capability of NATO. NATO as an organization will only be focused on the resilience of its networks and also promoting the same resilience with allies. But like in the other domains, NATO will rely on the capabilities, like in air, land, and sea. NATO doesn't have a force structure, it only has a command structure, but it can generate forces or assets or contributions from nations in order to achieve its missions of collective defense.
That's the deterrence effect.
Exactly.
Deterrence effect.
So this was the evolution that also shaped the institutional construct. Now, in this context, NATO developed mechanisms for information exchange, a malware information sharing platform between all allies, whereby indicators of cyber attacks are exchanged, malware tabs, and so on. Is established a cyber threat assessment cell, where high-level analysis is brought together, not just aspects of unfolding attacks, and also brought cyber awareness aspects into the intelligence sharing mechanism that it has established. It also has established MOU points of contact with each nation, so that there's seamless communication in cases of crisis. It established rapid reaction teams that could be deployed in case of an attack, be it across the NATO enterprise along the 60+ entities, or to support a nation under attack if it's requested, and if, of course, the North Atlantic Council approves. Just to give you a couple of examples.
Yeah. So let's think about this for a minute. What you're really describing, it seems to me, is that is the recognition on the part of NATO. I think to a large extent, you shouldn't be too modest under your guidance and under your tutelage of recognizing that cyber is the fourth operational domain. And that it needs to be taken seriously, both from the point of view of what kind of shall we say, needs to be taken seriously in terms of collective defense, which is part of NATO's mandate, but also at the same time in terms of deterrence effect and how you go about providing a cyber deterrence that makes a malign actor think twice before launching those kinds of attacks and what takes place there. It's not a pledge to take the offense, but it is a pledge to respond robustly and forcefully to a threat that it comes. Now that would be the case with all the other domains as well, isn't it? I mean, whether land, sea, air, including space, we think about space as an emerging domain as well. And yet there's something rather different about the cyber domain as an operational domain. How would you characterize its differences from the other more conventional domains where NATO's military and our military, United States military, have focused their efforts and focused their force structure?
Yeah. So first you brought an important aspect, that of cyber deterrence, and I will come back to it. And then the issue of the differences between this domain and the other domain. Well, this domain is different, number one, because it has been, again, created through technology, and it's operated by, private sector mainly and in technology. So it's like the bandwidth is given not by some, natural environment like air, land, and sea, but the technological environment, which is, by the way, in a fast change and evolution. So one aspect, speed of change. Secondly, what I mentioned also before, the easiness to hide behind anonymity. There are no driver's licenses in or plates like with the cards, identity plates. Pretty much like it was when the automobile was created. No rules, no driver's licenses, no driver's plates. The president of the Munich Security Conference, Ambassador Ischinger, who was also ambassador in Washington, says that it's a bit of a Wild West. This is how he called it, and so on.
Yes.
So everyone can hide behind this anonymity, and it's difficult to attribute.
Especially the advanced persistent threat.
Especially the advanced persistent threat, because they also use, like, as I said, proxies, and they hide behind them. And last but not least, it favors the offense, makes the defense and resilience difficult. And when it comes to employing potentially also offensive, let's say, tools or capabilities, these capabilities are rather unique. They're not like a box of ammunition or so on that has the same caliber and so on. And none of the users are ready to show them. Everyone keeps them. There's no transparency, because if you would make them transparent, you would lose them. So whenever you would employ or try to plan to address them, people would really think rather in terms of effects they generate rather than capabilities per se. So the approach has several differences also in terms of military planning, defense planning, and now I'm coming to the deterrence aspect. Mm-hmm. I mean, you cannot use cyber means for deterrence the way you use nuclear or conventional ones. Everyone knows what an effect of a nuclear weapon is, depending on how many kilotons and so on. Everyone knows what the effect of a 500 pounds, buster bomb is, or precision guiding munition and so on. And you can show them up to deter an adversary. You cannot use deterrence in cyber the same way. In a way, when we discuss about deterrence of cyber attacks, I think a good deterrence is deterrence by denial. The more resilience you have, the better you deter an adversary because you deny him the benefit of the investment in the attack. So that's why resilience and defense is at the core at the NATO mandate as well. And I think at every government level, so everyone starts with better resilience. And secondly is the development of norms, confident building measures, legal framework, so that we have a governed space rather than a Wild West. And last but not least, I think when it comes to deterrence by denial, by retribution, we think that this should be cross-domain deterrence. So in order to deter cyber attacks, at least at NATO level, if a cyber attack reaches an Article 5 level, it doesn't mean that NATO would automatically respond with cyber means. It could respond with all means available, from political means to military, if the threshold.
Given the gravity of the attack.
And this is actually, I think, a strong deterrent message. So there's no assumption that you only would respond in kind. It's the cross-domain response option that one reserves. And if it's below the threshold, it could be, other aspects like, and this is what also government think about, political, diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, in such a way that you don't generate unnecessary escalation, but you just change the calculation of the adversary so that he really has a sense of what's the price of an attempt of a future cyber attack. So this is a very hot issue, not just at NATO, it's also in this country, in OMS. What more to do to prevent this escalation of cyber attacks? Sometimes it's important just to speak out publicly. And if you look to the recent year and a half, especially after the U.S. election in 2016 and all discussion around it, in the context of European elections this year, you've seen more and more governments speaking out about the threat that they see and actually sending the message to the attackers that we see you, by the way, and don't cross the line, because then all options of response could be employed. And this was not the case 2 years, 3 years ago. So the fact that there is a public, sometimes it's a public attribution, and sometimes it's just a public warning, so to say.
Yes, and the way in which this is another aspect, of course, of the cyber domain is that it is now spilled over into the information domain.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the sort of the classic hacking attack and hacking activities are supplemented by, and in some cases even surpassed by, the efforts at spreading disinformation, what has come to be called fake news. But this is also operates in the same domain. It's also in overlaps with it. And I know that from the point of view of what we call warfighters, and from our own U.S. military, getting a solid grasp of how to deal with threats in the information domain has been extremely challenging. And I wonder if that's also true for dealing with the cyber domain. In other words, to what degree do the masters of the other domains have sometimes difficulty grasping and encompassing and understanding how cyber really is integral to how their domains function at a technical basis, but also can be hugely supportive for what their efforts are going to be about as members of NATO?
Well, 2 points here. You mentioned this stronger connectivity between cyber and information domain. I mean, in some jargon, some call information manipulation or information warfare the kind of soft cyber. I mean, you use the information and without actually disrupting the systems that are propagated it, while the hard cyber is actually the disruptions of systems and with the more disruptive or destructive effects. So more and more these two domains are seen, or aspects of the same are seen together. Then the link with the other air, land, and sea domains, I think everyone now understands that cyber is mainstreamed into what they are doing. I mean, every ship, every airplane, every tank or armored vehicle and so on relies on communications, relies on the computer, more and more, they're like computers with wings, with
right.
cannons or so on and so forth. So
bundles of algorithms is what they've become.
Exactly. So the intertwining between cyber and the other domains is even much closer than between the domains themselves. We made some analysis of how, let's say, defense strategy evolved when the air domain became a defense domain at the turn of the last century. And there were very many debates that were very familiar to us on cyber, and it took a while to understand how air should be linked to land forces, to naval forces. I think with cyber we were much faster to recognize that all the other domains depend on cyber, and then cyber itself could also potentially deliver effects that could be coordinated with the other ones. And in some cases, it could give options that would be more proportionate and potentially generate less collateral damage or loss of life. Cyber can be less lethal, and can imagine an exercise where some activity, be it activity of a government or a mission, a military mission, is really put at jeopardy due to, let's say, a simple attack, distributed denial of service attack that disrupts functionality. And these are the kind of attacks that also are easily attributable. At least you can get towards the source through technical means. Now, in order to stop the disruption, and you have the location where it comes for, or the locations, you can take them down with kinetic means in an operation, let me put it this way. Or you could easily and with less collateral damage stop them through countermeasures in the cyber domain. So from this point of view, people have started to recognize, and especially military commanders, that it would offer options that would be really closer linked to their obligation under law to find the option to achieve the mission by using the least lethal or the option that generates no or least collateral damage.
Right, and it can even exercise that option in a decisive way. If your enemy can't fire any of its weapons, he's out of luck.
In all honesty, in all fairness, one should also think about the other aspects. The fact that cyber options like this we should make sure that they have a discriminate effect, and they do not generate effects that are, let's say, spread over or beyond the operational theater. And
like
I think
attacks on the electric grid.
Exactly. So they cannot do this. This would actually be harmful, and this is where actually NATO and democratic governments support the idea that these should be protected, and this is why any capabilities that are thought of being employed to deliver such effects should really have the effects of precision-guided, if you want, effects and so on, rather than raw. Let's say, like it's like the difference between, carpet bombing to.
I was just going to say it exactly.
Precision-guided munitions.
Carpet cyber bombing. So something that we talked about earlier, the idea that in dealing with the cyber domain, that cognitive gap.
Yeah.
Between thinking about the other domains, you're seeing that gap closing pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah, we're definitely better, and I always like to look to the full full half of the glass. The cognitive gap will continue to be a challenge because of the evolution of technology. Yeah. And by the way, cognitive gap was one of the challenges between translating the language of technology, digital language, into the language of policy and strategy. This is something that I think it's at the heart of the debate in this country, in other democratic countries, to understand how this technological evolution impacts society in so many ways, including from the point of view of security, and what political decision makers should be asked to implement in order to respond to the implications of technology. So I think we came a long way in the last years of having this translation of the digital into strategy, definitely into bringing, in the military terms, the domains together. But I also have to say that with the new, let's say, developments at the horizon, cloud computing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all these will bring new elements that would need us to close this cognitive gap. When you start to discuss about quantum computing, it's a whole new ballgame in terms of comprehending and generating the kind of strategic questions that need to be answered by the political decision maker.
You see, the ambassador is pushing my hot button when he talks about quantum, because that's one of the projects that we're engaged in here at Hudson, is on developing a national quantum initiative because of the challenges that it represents. Do you want to say something a little bit about, not necessarily about quantum, but just my last question for you is, where you see future threats coming and where you see future advantages coming with regard to the cyber domain?
Let me start with the IoT revolution, that we're not just scratching the surface. I mean, this will blow up in the next couple of years, not more. Think about how much the attack surface will grow. So it's an issue of scale. If IoTs will not be developed with some security by design, they will multiply the attack entry points with orders of magnitude. So there has to be some process of certification from the point of view of cybersecurity, and also we have to think about security layers and rules and everything. It has to start with enhancing our education on the basic cyber hygiene aspects, because if you have everything connected from your light bulbs to the refrigerator and so on, and I think in every house we will need to have a kind of cloud with layers of security. I mean, some things don't need to be secured so much, others would be, because you don't want everything to be linked to your computer that you're working every day, where you do your banking stuff and so on. Otherwise, you need to employ all the sensors with high security, and they're very expensive. You can apply some ones that will be less expensive, but definitely decouple them from your main business, very, very much like we do in more, let's say, complex organizations. Right. The IoT also brings some other element that I fear will make things a bit more dangerous. They link the virtual space with the physical space. And the temptation to have at the end of a cyber attack something that will generate the boom will be irresistible, including by terrorists. I mean, one of the conclusions why I would say cyber terrorism has not been growing, thanks God, so fast as maybe we feared even 5 years ago, because there's still this temptation of terrorists to do spectacular things. Well, with the IoT, they could generate spectacular things through just playing with the keyboards and so on, which brings me to the need also to address this in depth. Of course, the cloud technologies, artificial intelligence would generate challenges, because there could be so many ways of faking identities, from pictures to anything else. But let me also come with the other side of the coin. I'm a strong believer that technology in itself also brings the right solutions and can really strengthen the capability of the defender if it's employed rightly and it's taken into consideration. We already use algorithm and artificial intelligence to study anomalies of behavior or traffic against our networks. This is what advanced cyber analytics are doing. This, with the new algorithm, this will be increasing. And the same, for example, with quantum computer that could make communications virtually unbreakable, cyberspace secure. So I'm not advocating of running away from technological level for innovation. No, actually of embracing more of the innovation on the side of the defenders.
Should we open it up to questions
Sure,
from the audience?
sure.
If you would, if you have a question for the ambassador, if you would raise your hand, and one of our interns will come to you with a microphone. And then if you could very kindly identify yourself and name your affiliation, however much of affiliation you care to give, and then we'll be happy to hear your questions. Should we go there and then to the young lady over here?
Hi, good afternoon. John Feroldi from Charter Communications. My question has to do with the Geneva Convention and how nation states have, in my mind, not adhered to the convention standards, and what would be, in the cyber world, what would you envision would that take hold in this similar type of situation be adhered to, where they would not adhere to the standards that put out by the world bodies?
Okay, so you're meaning the real Geneva Convention, the original one that was developed after the World Wars, so to say, to promote international humanitarian law. I think that there are two great contributions that have really brought more clarity on the applicability of Geneva Convention for cyberspace. One was the first report of the United Nations Governmental Group of Experts, who said that international law is applicable. So it was a recognition that if there is a conflict and cyber is applied in this conflict, then those rules that are supposed to protect civilians should apply also from cyber attacks. And interesting enough, in this debate also the International Red Cross has been involved, and we had actually also dialogue, and there were conferences and so on. The other big contribution is the so-called Tallinn Manual that was developed by the NATO Center of Excellence on Cyber Defense in Tallinn. And that one goes into details of how, examples of how this should apply. And what they're doing is they're reducing the number of gray zones in terms of interpretation. There are still gray zones, but they're reducing them. And the Tallinn Manual 1 was focused on the applicability of international law in cyberspace in the context of a conflict. Then they came with Tallinn 2, which was published in February this year, where they added to this the kind of rules that should be governed in cyberspace below the conflict of armed attack, like cyber operations below threshold armed attack. So these are important contributions, and frankly, they both reinforce the Geneva Convention in its applicability to cyber.
I think also part of the gentleman's question was, can we expect that a cyber conventions of these kinds at international level would be any more effective than Geneva Convention has been historically in terms of restraining those who are ruthless enough or have find ways around those conventions? Any thoughts?
I mean, what the effort is right now is to grow the normative framework for the situations below the threshold of conflict. This is what the idea from Microsoft
Now
is.
that could be a very big step.
Exactly. Yeah. And these are all these initiatives, you know, from I mean, continuous effort from the UNGG, OEC, industry, Microsoft, from this Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace. They're all supposed to come with ideas, proposals of norms that maybe at a certain point will be the basis of some arrangement with governments and other players, but we're not there yet.
No, but it's a step in that direction. And yes, next question.
Hi, my name is Julie Crowley. I'm a cybersecurity consultant with Price Waterhouse. And so my question for you is around the role in government to regulate cyber defense in the private sector. I'm working mostly with Fortune 50 companies in the critical infrastructure areas where, to your point around the convergence of the physical and the technical world, you know, estimates of an attack on the U.S. power grid could cause over 1,000 fatalities, you know, in an extreme case. So today, it seems like a lot of these companies are going it alone in terms of determining what the right level of cyber defense is. But what do you think the role of government should be to influence that?
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And this is an important issue, and it also brings forward an important dilemma of you know, how much to regulate and how much to let other, or let's say the dilemma between self-regulation and like government regulation. I think the first step is usually to establish some incentives, and governments also can establish such incentives that would improve security. And this was very much the approach in the United States, and frankly also in the European Union with the NIS, Network Information Security Directive. So to first establish some norms, voluntary norms by industry, whereby they would apply some minimum level of cyber security. Then a step forward will be also to establish some certification mechanisms. So you can generate a certification authority, and many countries have it. UK have it, and now there is a plan also under the EU framework to bring certification into the ENISA, or the what they will want to call the future cybersecurity company, whereby not everyone has to apply the same standards, but those who want to be seen on the market as providing more secure products, they get certified, and then they're also more attractive to sell their product or their services because they're certified. And these are market incentives. And then you have regulatory incentives that really say, well, you cannot go below this level of security because then you're liable in administrative, legally, and so on and so forth. It's like we do for car safety, for electrical grid safety, and so on and so forth. If I believe that there has to be more involvement of government, I think there has to be a stronger interaction between government and the private sector in order to develop this. So yes, more involvement, but more involvement in dialogue with the private sector, not just imposing stuff without consulting at right, and actually convincing a private sector that in some situations regulating more can actually bring better, let's say, also better business opportunities because people feel that they can rely on the product or the service, so there's more business opportunity out of it.
Yep. Dennis, do you have a question?
My initial question was actually more or less the same as the previous speaker, who pays for cybersecurity and at the different levels, personal, business, and government. But if you have anything to add on that. Then my second question would be attribution, which is very hard in cyber. I mean, it was a rare case with North Korea and the Sony hack, where the US government sort of stepped out and says, we positively sort of identify you. So I just wonder your thoughts on that and how you work around that, and the whole question of whether it's non-state actors that are affiliated with a state actor, and these sort of whole attribution chains.
Well, let me say, yes, I agree with you. The difficulty of attribution should not be underestimated. But I also add something to that. It should not be also overestimated. And I'm telling you why. With the employment of advanced cyber analytics, the technical analysis of threats has really evolved tremendously. I would echo those who are saying, and I work from the NATO experience, but you might find this also, this statement from others who are in cybersecurity business, that attribution, technical attribution could bring this level to a 75, even 80% accuracy. Now, is this enough to go to court? Well, in the cybercrime sector, is not enough. You need to really convince to go if you go to court. And it's a challenge, especially in the criminal world. And I tell you, my friends from who are in the cyber crime fighting business, they always like to point to this asymmetry between the easiness to attack and the difficulty to prosecute somebody. So they're moving with the speed, the attackers are moving with the speed of light, and we are moving with the speed of law. I mean, that's very, it shows what the asymmetry in this is. But when it comes to high-end attacks, and if you have where you can employ this technical resources of like states or intergovernmental organizations like NATO, and you can put on top of it not just on top of the technical analysis, intelligence analysis, this goes up to the 95% level, which is really really high, because they're combining the systems analysis with what they see from intelligence sources underground. They're providing the link between a proxy and potentially a state actor, which is not seen, but you can depict it through intelligence analysis. And at the end of the day, at government level, the attribution is an issue of confidence, and it's a political decision to really say, well, we have this attribution with high level of confidence or very high level of confidence, and based on this to take the following measures. I mean, when the previous administration took the decision, for example, for the diplomatic sanctions, it was based like, confidence of analysis of this mixing into the election process, and then it said, well, the response is in diplomatic terms. So this is how it has to be seen. I have to say also that in the cybercrime sector, the employment of algorithms and the better connectivity between the players and also more knowledge among the prosecutors, so embedding them with technical experts has increased the rate of successful, I would say, prosecution. So there's a positive trend as well, but still we're not filling the gap. I mean, cybercrime is evolving tremendously, and in some cases, a big portion of what nations gain in terms of, let's say, GDP growth from technology, from innovation, is lost due to the low level of cybersecurity. And in some cases, it can really be a lot. There are a number of examples. It's called Cybersecurity Index, and they're performed by a couple of agencies around the world, and where they make these examples. And in some cases in the developing world, there were examples where it was proven that they were the brink of the whole gain from innovation, from being wired, would be offset by the lack of investment in the cybersecurity. And that's why I said, even at the UN level, we should not just support digital, let's say, outreach across the world in the developing world. It should be accompanied with cybersecurity.
Right, in a multi-domain kind of basis. Another question? We have one over here.
Mr. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. My name is Arnie Dupuy. I'm a Booz Allen employee working at the DASD Operational Energy. So when I say operational energy, I mean that energy such as liquid fuels and battlefield power that the warfighter needs to conduct his or her mission. So more and more from the Pentagon, we're seeing this confluence of energy and cyber operational energy and cyber. And as operations become more and more networked, we're seeing a series of potential vulnerabilities. So I think one of the more encouraging things I've seen was the collaboration between the Energy Security Center of Excellence and the Cyber Center of Excellence. I attribute that to your leadership. Do you have any sense of your successor, I should say, having the same long-term vision, particularly when we're bringing in centers of excellence and also academia and private sector?
Well, thank you for that question. I would say that these centers of excellence, and there are now 24 that NATO has accredited, are a huge resource. And in the last years, we have seen unprecedented cooperation among them. And one example is like Center of Excellence in Lithuania, which is focused on energy security, really taking on board lessons learned of how to ensure security of energy networks from cyber attacks. After all, we had some examples where, for example, for security cameras that were put on pipelines to assure physical security were actually the anti-prime of cyber attackers and generated blow up, so to say. And this was studied and generated some benchmarks. In NATO, the Center of Excellence on Energy Security has been in the forefront and established or bringing security standards among the so-called NATO STANAG process. Logistical standards for pipelines, for networks, and also linking this with what they call the innovative energy solutions for military applications, where you both reduce the amounts of energy that is employed to conduct some operations, at the same time increasing the security. In a way, it helps reducing. You're not relying so much on the networked energy footprint. You can generate more energy on the spot in the operations center to this mixed grid with wind, solar, diesel, and so on. You reduce the kind of logistical footprint by a concept through this smart energy concept. At the same time, whatever is left to be protected, you employ the best practices that you learn, especially from the cyber sector when it comes to protecting them through cyber means. So this is one examples where standards from cyber have been embedded with the standards for energy security, and they feed into the STANAG process.
Can you very quickly characterize NATO centers of excellence for those who don't know the term, haven't run across them? There's been a rapid proliferation of them very, very recently.
They actually evolved in the last decade, practically. And they came from the idea to expand NATO's pool of high-level expertise without actually, let's say, expanding NATO's footprint, and in a context of rather reducing budgets than growing budgets. So they're not operating on NATO budget. They're initiatives by a number of nations, allied nations, and in some cases, allied plus partners, because you have Sweden, Finland, Austria, other non-NATO allies that are part of the Center of Excellence. In some cases, Georgia, Ukraine, others, Israel. So they establish those centers, but they are certified by Atlantic Command Transformation according to some NATO objectives. So they're not owned by NATO, and not all the products are becoming NATO products, not even the Tallinn manual. So it was developed by the Center of Excellence in Estonia. It's a resource for NATO, but it's not a consensual document, not a NATO document per se. So very much like this, in cyber security, energy security, strategic communications to fight also information warfare. In counterterrorism, we have 3 centers of excellence. One is generic, the other one is focused on counter IED, improvised explosive devices, and another one on the potential use of weapons of mass destruction by terrorists. They have proliferated in a good sense in the last 10 years, and they are an important resource, and they're also a resource not just for NATO allies, as I said. They can be for also other partner organizations like the EU. In some cases, we cooperate with the United Nations. They are a strong resource for what we're doing, for example, now to support training and education and capacity building in partner countries. There's a huge effort by NATO to train its partners in the southern neighborhood in the fight against terrorism, addressing terrorism at the source. And Center of Excellence are at the front for it, of it. And sometimes, as I said, they operate with UN programs, EU programs, so we don't have unnecessary duplication, and we have coordination and deconfliction.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question, if someone has one. Sure.
You mentioned the lessons learned. How often are those distributed to a wider audience? Again, I'm speaking generally this time, but as far as the, for instance, the energy, cyber, would those be available to a wider audience to generate that that kind of cooperation?
Yeah, there are two types of lessons learned. One are the ones that are, let's say, formal, and they're circulated in a restricted format, and they're coming from exercises, and then they fuel what we call the process of they update doctrine or procedures and processes. But there's also informal ways. For example, the Center of Excellence in Lithuania on energy security has an annual event. It's called, if I'm not mistaken, NIAS, Novative, not NIAS. Anyway, it's an event that they're having annually, and it's open to the public. NIAS is the NATO Information Assurance Seminar, and the other one is focused on energy aspects, and I forgot the acronym, so I'm too many acronyms. Yeah.
Right. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to pose to you the last question, and I'm not going to be able to let you go until I bring up the issue of the calls for NATO defense budget increases from NATO member countries. President Obama made the call. Secretary of Defense Gates in his farewell speech made the call. President Trump has made the call. Secretary General of NATO has made the call. Quite apart from the issue of the political aspects of this, when we think about the spending on the defense budget in terms of conventional forces, that's one area. How would you see increases in defense budgets by NATO countries having an impact on cyber defense?
Well, first and foremost, I think the issue of increasing defense budget continues to be very timely. I think NATO is in a much better place than it was at the Wales Summit, where it brought back the 2% aspect. And I think in the last years, not only we are increasing the budgets per se, but we are also increasing the capabilities. And also structurally, for the first time at the last meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, of Defense, Minister of Defense of NATO, there was an agreement on an outline design of the NATO command structure that would, for the first time, grow after it was downsized from 40,000 to 15,000 to 7,000. And now, for the first time, it will grow with new elements, including an aspect that has to do with cyber, for example, Cyber Operations Center. There will be another component that will focus on logistics, another one on the threats in the North Atlantic, just to give you a sense. So all of a sudden, we are in a different dynamic. Yes, it was logical to downsize after the end of the Cold War and cash in the peace dividend in a context where the threat landscape was, let's say, decreasing in terms of concern and so on, and it's logical to scale back up when the threat landscape is growing. How to leverage this resource or the extra resources towards cyber. NATO was not, let's say, has not put, as I said, a figure on investment in cyber defense. But due to the fact that in the cyber defense pledge that was assumed politically as a separate document by heads of state and government, it says prioritization of resources for cyber defense. In itself, it brought the issue on the front burner. Now, this is then quantified through what is called metrics of mapping how states implement this pledge. and there will be a report on the cyber defense pledge to the next summit in July, and that in itself probably will get more granular into what to recommend and where to put the resources. We're not there yet. I mean, I learned in these years, for example, that so not for military purposes, but for example, for the security of the industry in Israel, for example, there is a requirement that all, at least government entities, in their investment for IT modernization, 16% at least, a minimum, should be invested in the security part of it. And there are more nations that are thinking about it in these terms. And these examples, I don't know, might inspire also some future evolution in NATO. So it's a high priority to invest into cyber. It doesn't have yet numbers attached to it.
I want to thank Ambassador Soren Ducaro for sharing his knowledge and expertise and information with us today. And so I want to thank you, and I also want to say welcome to Hudson.
Thank you. Thank you again.